My name is Claire. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I was known as a steady woman with a steady marriage and a steady presence online. I worked, I showed up, I smiled when it was expected. I wasn't loud, I wasn't dramatic, I wasn't the woman people warned others about. I was the woman people assumed would always be fine. From the outside, my life looked orderly. Tasteful photos, anniversary captions, quiet domestic moments, shared just enough to feel intimate but not indulgent. Friends would comment on how grounded we seemed. Strangers would message me, asking how we kept the spark alive. What they didn't see was that my marriage looked perfect online while we slept in separate rooms. They didn't see the distance that had become routine, the silence that replaced curiosity, or the way affection slowly turned into logistics. If you had met me then, you might have underestimated me. Most people did. They thought I was passive because I was calm. They thought I was compliant because I didn't argue in public. They thought silence meant agreement. It never did. Silence, for me, was observation. It was listening long enough to understand the full shape of what I was living inside. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing someone or humiliating anyone. It's about emotional justice, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't shout, and doesn't need applause to be complete. It's about how psychological reversal doesn't happen in a moment of anger, but in a long season of clarity. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how a marriage can erode quietly, how disrespect often arrives disguised as normalcy, and how a woman can change her position without raising her voice. You'll hear about the small cuts that were easy to dismiss, the role I was assigned without being asked, and the moment I realized that staying silent didn't mean staying powerless. You'll also hear about preparation, about patience, about the kind of strength that doesn't rush to be seen. This is a documentary-style account of how I moved from invisibility to agency, not by confrontation, but by alignment with my own moral code. There are no villains here, no dramatic showdowns, no sudden miracles, just cause and effect, unfolding at a human pace. And yes, there were captions, carefully written ones, smiling ones, hopeful ones. But the captions were lies, not malicious lies, but convenient ones. Lies we tell others when we haven't yet told ourselves the truth. If you're listening to this because you've ever felt quietly erased, or politely dismissed, or praised for being low maintenance, when what you really were was unheard, this story might feel familiar. And if you're listening from the other side, certain that silence always means consent, it might feel uncomfortable. I'm not here to judge either position. I'm only here to tell the truth, slowly and completely. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever sensed a shift in your life long before you could explain it? To most people, I was dependable in a way that felt almost invisible. I was the woman who replied on time, remembered birthdays, organized weekends, and smoothed over awkward moments before they became uncomfortable. In group settings, I was often described as easygoing or low maintenance. In my marriage, I was understanding. That word followed me everywhere, like a compliment that slowly became a container. I didn't arrive in rooms demanding attention. I arrived prepared. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed patterns before people noticed me. And because I wasn't volatile or unpredictable, my presence became something others leaned on without really looking at. Reliability, I learned, can become a way people stop checking if you're okay. My husband used to introduce me as the calm one. He said it affectionately, smiling, as if he were proud of having chosen someone stable. People would nod approvingly. Calm women are safe women after all. Calm women don't disrupt dinners or ask inconvenient questions. Calm women don't change the temperature of a room. What no one realized was that my calm wasn't emptiness. It was containment. I felt things deeply, but I processed them privately. I didn't externalize discomfort because I had learned early on that naming it often made others defensive. It was easier for them, and at the time for me, if I handled it quietly. In our marriage, I became the emotional constant. I remembered what he liked and avoided what irritated him. I adjusted my rhythms to match his. When he withdrew, I filled the gap. When he forgot, I reminded him without resentment, or at least without visible resentment. Over time, the balance shifted so subtly that it didn't register as an imbalance at all. It just felt like adulthood. Friends admired our stability. They'd say things like, "You two never fight," or "You're so solid." I'd smile and agree because technically, it was true. We didn't fight. We also didn't talk. Not in the way that builds intimacy. We exchanged information, not curiosity. Updates, not vulnerability. It was efficient, polite, hollow. Online, I curated what felt acceptable to share. Anniversary photos, a well-lit dinner, a caption about gratitude. Nothing extravagant, nothing dishonest, at least not on the surface. But what those images concealed was the growing sense that I was more visible to strangers than to the person I shared a home with. At home, I was useful. I handled logistics, schedules, and emotional labor with quiet precision. If something went wrong, I fixed it before it became a conversation. That, I think, is where the invisibility began. When problems disappear without effort, people stop wondering how they were solved. No one asked how I was really doing, not because they didn't care, but because I didn't look like someone who needed asking. I carried myself like someone who had already handled it. And so, I became the woman people leaned on, the woman people assumed would adapt. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being consistently underestimated, not in intelligence, but in depth. People saw me as composed, but not complex, supportive, but not strategic, present, but not powerful. I was the background harmony, not the melody. Even my husband, I think, came to see me as a constant rather than a choice. I was there. Therefore, I would continue to be there. My needs were subtle. They were optional. My silence was misread as contentment. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I participated in this perception. I believed that being steady was a virtue. I believed love meant making things easier for the other person. I believed that if something truly mattered, it would naturally be noticed. What I didn't yet understand was that invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It builds from moments where you don't correct an assumption, don't interrupt a narrative, don't insist on being seen. And once people learn a version of you that asks for nothing, they rarely imagine you might one day ask for everything. That was who I was to them, reliable, calm, quietly supportive, a woman whose presence was felt only when it was missing. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. There was no raised voice, no sharp sentence that echoed in my chest. It was small enough to dismiss, which is why everyone else did. Which is why, for a while, I tried to do the same. We were at a dinner with friends, nothing formal, just one of those familiar gatherings where conversation drifts and plates stay half full. Someone asked my husband a question about a decision we had made together, something logistical, something ordinary. Before I could answer, he spoke over me, not loudly, not aggressively, just quickly, as if my response was unnecessary. I paused mid-thought. No one noticed. The conversation moved on without me. He didn't look at me afterward, didn't check in, didn't say, "Oh, sorry, you were about to say something." It wasn't intentional, I told myself. He's tired, he's distracted. It's not worth making awkward. That's how the first small cut happens. It comes with a ready-made explanation. On the drive home, I replayed it. Not obsessively, just enough to register the discomfort. I asked myself if I was being sensitive. I often ask myself that. Sensitivity was the accusation I used on my own emotions before anyone else could. The thing was, it wasn't the interruption that lingered. It was the assumption underneath it. The unspoken belief that my voice was optional, that my contribution could be edited out without consequence. I told myself it was a one-off. Everyone interrupts sometimes. Everyone missteps. Healthy relationships don't keep score. So I let it go, the way I had learned to let so many things go, by absorbing the discomfort inward and smoothing the surface outward. But something in me noted it, quietly, precisely. Over the following weeks, there were other moments, each minor enough to excuse. He would answer questions directed at me. He would summarize my thoughts in group conversations, trimming the nuance. He would make plans that affected both of us and inform me after the fact, as if I were being briefed rather than consulted. None of it was cruel. That's what made it confusing. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself with malice. Sometimes it arrives dressed as efficiency. When I mentioned one of these moments, gently, carefully, he smiled and said, "You're overthinking it." Not unkindly, almost reassuringly, as if my perception were the problem, not the pattern. I nodded. Of course. I didn't want to be the kind of person who turned small things into big ones. I didn't want to introduce friction where there didn't need to be any. So I adjusted. I spoke a little faster. I asserted myself just enough to feel present, but not enough to be labeled difficult. The strange part was how invisible the shift felt to everyone else. Friends didn't notice. The family didn't notice. Online, nothing changed. The caption stayed warm. The photo stayed composed. The narrative remained intact. But inside, a line had been crossed. Not dramatically, more like a boundary brushed past without permission. And once that happens, your body remembers, even if your mouth stays quiet. I began to notice how often I deferred without being asked. How often I filled in gaps rather than naming them. How often I chose harmony over clarity. I wasn't angry. I was alert. There's a difference. The first small cut didn't hurt much. It didn't bleed. But it marked the beginning of something I couldn't unsee. A recalibration of how my presence was valued. A subtle reordering of whose voice carried weight. And still, I said nothing. Not because I was weak, but because I was trying to understand what I was looking at. I needed to know whether this was a moment or a direction. That discernment took time. It required patience. It required silence. Because when you speak too early, people defend themselves. When you stay quiet a little longer, they reveal themselves. What began as isolated moments slowly stitched itself into routine. Not abruptly, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet consistency that makes something feel normal before you realize you've agreed to it. I learned the rhythm of being slightly outpaced. Conversations moved just fast enough that my pauses felt like hesitation. Decisions were made just quickly enough that questioning them felt inconvenient. I wasn't excluded. I was bypassed. And because I was still physically present, because I was still included in the end result, it was easy to tell myself nothing was really wrong. This is how disrespect survives, by staying just below the threshold of confrontation. I adjusted without announcing it. I stopped beginning sentences with "I think" because they rarely made it to the end. I framed my opinions as suggestions, softened my language, and made my certainty palatable. I became fluent in preemptive compromise, not because anyone demanded it, but because I sensed it was expected. At home, the dynamic followed the same pattern. We coordinated our lives efficiently, but intimacy receded. Our conversations were practical and task-oriented. When I tried to talk about something deeper, something emotional, he'd nod, offer a solution, and move on. There was no curiosity about my inner world, only a polite acknowledgement of its existence. I told myself this was what long-term relationships look like. That passion naturally quiets. That comfort replaces intensity. I repeated these narratives because they were familiar, because they were socially endorsed, and because they made staying silent feel mature. I didn't want to be the woman who needed too much. I didn't want to be accused of creating problems where there were none. So I normalized the absence of attunement. I treated emotional neglect as neutrality. Looking back, I realize how skilled I became at self-erasure. I minimized my reactions before they reached my face. I edited my needs before they reached my mouth. I became so good at this that even I started to forget what I was doing. What troubled me most wasn't his behavior. It was how quickly I adapted to it. There's a moment in normalization where something shifts internally. You stop asking, "Is this okay?" and start asking, "How do I live with this?" That's when the role begins to solidify. That's when tolerance is mistaken for consent. I watched myself rationalize things I would have once named. When he forgot something important to me, I told myself it wasn't intentional. When he dismissed a concern, I told myself he was stressed. When he made a unilateral decision, I told myself it was easier this way. Each explanation was reasonable. Collectively, they formed a pattern of disappearance. Friends would still say, "You're so lucky. He's so easygoing." And in many ways, he was. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't volatile. He simply took up space without noticing how much he was occupying. And I made room without realizing how much I was giving up. Online, I continued to share small moments of warmth, not to deceive, but to preserve coherence. It felt strange to present a fractured reality when I wasn't yet sure how to name the fracture. So I maintained the image. I smiled. I captioned gratitude. I played my part. The captions were lies, but not in the way people imagine lies. They were lies of omission, carefully cropped truths, moments framed without context, a version of my life that excluded the quiet loneliness I hadn't yet admitted to myself. I became adept at telling myself that silence was strength, that patience was a virtue, that understanding was love. And for a long time, those beliefs sustained me. But underneath them, something else was growing, a low-grade alertness, a sense that I was being shaped by the absence of resistance, that every time I chose not to speak, the version of me others interacted with became a little flatter, a little more predictable. Normalization doesn't feel like harm. It feels like an adaptation. It feels like maturity. It feels like choosing peace. Until one day you realize you no longer recognize the shape of your own desires. That realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, in the way I hesitated before speaking, even when I knew the answer. In the meantime, I felt relief when plans were canceled because it meant fewer opportunities to feel unseen. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't planning anything. I was still very much inside the story, trying to make sense of it from within. But something fundamental had changed. I had stopped assuming that being quiet meant being safe. And once that assumption breaks, you start listening differently, not just to others, but to yourself. Roles don't always come with an announcement. No one sits you down and explains what's expected. They emerge gradually, through repetition, through what gets rewarded and what gets ignored. By the time you notice them, they already feel established. My role was reliability. I was the one who remembered, the one who adjusted, the one who made things smoother. In our marriage, I became the infrastructure, the background system that kept everything running. And like most systems that function well, I stopped being acknowledged as something that required care. When people spoke about me, they used words like solid, and practical, and supportive. These weren't insults. They were compliments that came with an expiration date. They described usefulness, not presence, stability, not agency. At home, this role meant I was consulted last, if at all, not because my opinion was unwanted, but because it was assumed. He knew what I would say, or thought he did, and because I rarely contradicted him publicly, that assumption went unchallenged. I noticed how often I was expected to absorb inconvenience. Schedule changes, emotional distance. Decisions are made quickly, then explained afterward. My adaptability became a given, not a gift. The unspoken agreement was clear. I would be the one who held things together. He would be the one who moved forward. What unsettled me wasn't that this role existed. It was how seamlessly I had stepped into it. I had internalized the idea that being useful was a form of love, that reducing friction was a contribution, that my needs, if truly important, would naturally rise to the surface. But needs don't rise in environments that reward silence. I started to see how the role extended beyond my marriage. In social settings, I was the mediator. At work, I was the one who caught mistakes before they escalated. I was trusted, but rarely centered, valued, but not prioritized. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being the reliable one. You don't collapse because people depend on you. You don't protest because it would disrupt the order you've helped maintain. So you carry on, quietly adjusting your expectations downward. The moment I recognized the role for what it was, didn't come from conflict. It came from observation. I noticed how my absence changed things. When I stopped anticipating needs, small issues surfaced. When I stopped smoothing transitions, tension appeared. People reached out. not to ask how I was, but to restore the function I had paused. That was when it became clear. I was being experienced less as a person and more as a resource. This realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Anger can blur. Precision sharpens. I began to watch how expectations were placed on me without being spoken. How gratitude was implied rather than expressed. How my calm was relied upon to absorb what others didn't want to handle. And still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have reinforced the existing narrative, that I was reacting emotionally, that I was disrupting harmony. Instead, I stayed where I was and observed the structure of the role itself. Roles persist because they're convenient. They simplify dynamics. They allow others to operate without self-reflection. And once you've been placed in one, people relate to you through it, not around it. What I began to understand was this. As long as I continued to perform the role flawlessly, nothing would change. My reliability was the very thing preventing renegotiation. That awareness didn't immediately translate into action. It translated into restraint. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped preemptively fixing. I allowed minor discomfort to exist without rushing to erase it. These were small internal shifts, barely visible from the outside. But internally, something was recalibrating. I was no longer asking how to perform the role better. I was asking whether the role deserved my continued participation. And once that question enters your mind, you're no longer invisible to yourself. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no dramatic realization, no sentence that changed everything. In fact, if you had been watching us, you would have seen nothing at all. That's what made it unmistakable. It was a quiet morning, ordinary light through the kitchen window, the sound of the coffee machine, familiar and unremarkable. We were standing in the same space, moving around each other with the efficiency of people who knew each other's habits well, but no longer checked in. He was talking about work, about a plan he was excited about something that would affect both of us. I was listening, as I always did, nodding in the right places, waiting for the pause that would signal my turn. It never came. He finished his thought, picked up his mug, and moved on to the next topic without looking at me, without asking what I thought, without noticing that I hadn't spoken at all. And something in me went very still. Not hurt, not angry, just clear. I realized in that moment that my presence was no longer required for the exchange to continue. I was there as an audience, not a participant. And more importantly, I had been allowing that position to feel normal. The shift wasn't emotional, it was cognitive. I saw the entire structure of our dynamic with sudden distance, like stepping back from a painting you've been standing too close to. I understood that this wasn't about one person being careless or one moment being missed. It was about a system that had formed, sustained by my silence and his assumption. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't correct him. I didn't announce what I was realizing. I finished my coffee, gathered my things, and left the house exactly as I always did. But internally, something had detached. I stopped interpreting his behavior as something to be fixed or explained. I stopped asking what I could do differently to re-engage him. Instead, I asked a quieter, more decisive question. What information does this give me? From that day forward, I paid attention in a new way. Not emotionally, but strategically. I noticed how often conversations were one-directional, how decisions were framed as updates rather than discussions, how my agreement was assumed before it was given. And I noticed my own body, how tension used to rise in my chest when I felt dismissed, how now there was space, distance, the kind that allows you to think clearly. The shift wasn't about leaving. It wasn't even about planning. It was about no longer participating unconsciously. There's a particular moment when you stop hoping someone will notice your absence and start noticing it yourself. That was the moment. I realized that I had been waiting for acknowledgement to grant myself permission to change, to speak differently, to choose differently, to exist differently. And that permission was never going to come from outside. So I stopped waiting. I didn't confront him because confrontation would have centered his response. I didn't withdraw dramatically because drama would have obscured the clarity I was gaining. I simply became more observant and less reactive. Silence for the first time felt like a choice rather than a habit. I still smiled, I still showed up. I still maintained the surface of normalcy. But internally, I was no longer negotiating my worth in real time. I was gathering data. That morning didn't change my circumstances. It changed my orientation. I no longer needed reassurance to stay, and I no longer needed anger to leave. I had stepped into a third position, one where I could see the full picture without being consumed by it. The shift was invisible. That's why it was powerful. Because once you see clearly, you don't need to announce that you're changing. You simply stop being available for dynamics that no longer serve you, and the world adjusts, or it doesn't. Either way, you move differently. After that morning, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I slipped into to avoid friction, to keep things smooth, to preserve the version of myself others expected. Now it was deliberate, measured, quiet in a way that conserved energy instead of spending it. I stopped filling conversational gaps. When a question was asked vaguely, I didn't rush to clarify it. When decisions were announced rather than discussed, I noted them without immediately responding. I wasn't sulking. I wasn't withdrawing. I was simply no longer compensating. At first, nothing happened. That's the part people don't talk about. When you stop over-functioning, there's often a lag. The system continues as if nothing has changed, because it assumes the missing effort will reappear. He continued speaking in long, uninterrupted stretches. He continued making plans at his own pace. He continued assuming my alignment, and I continued observing. What changed was my internal posture. I no longer felt the subtle urgency to be understood in the moment. I didn't need to correct assumptions as they formed. I let them exist long enough to reveal their consequences. There's a strange power in letting people move forward on their own narratives. My silence began to be misread. He interpreted it as agreement, as flexibility, as my usual calm. Friends interpreted it as maturity. Even I might have misread it once upon a time. But I knew what it was, restraint. I was no longer offering emotional labor for free. I was no longer translating my experience into something easily digestible. I was keeping my inner world intact, unedited. That kind of silence can be unsettling, not immediately, but eventually. Because when someone is used to you reacting, your stillness removes their cues. I noticed moments where he looked at me longer than usual, as if waiting for something. I noticed pauses that lingered just a second too long. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't name the shift. He simply moved on. That told me everything I needed to know. If my absence of reaction wasn't enough to prompt curiosity, then curiosity had never been central to the dynamic, and that clarity was grounding. I began to take notes, not literally at first, but mentally. Patterns, timelines, the gap between what was said and what was done. The assumptions that went unchallenged were comfortable. Silence gave me room to see without being seen. At work, the same strategy applied. I stopped volunteering solutions before problems were fully defined. I waited. I listened. I let others reveal how much they relied on my preemptive effort. The results were consistent. Things slowed down. Small inefficiencies appeared. Questions were asked that had previously never reached me because I had already answered them before they were spoken. No one accused me of changing. They simply experienced the absence of something they hadn't realized was there. At home, the emotional distance didn't widen dramatically. It clarified. We moved through our routines with the same efficiency. We shared meals, we exchanged information, but there was no longer an undercurrent of me trying to be felt. I wasn't reaching. I wasn't waiting. And without that effort, the imbalance became more visible. Silence, when chosen, does something important. It reveals who steps forward to meet you and who continues walking as if you were never beside them. I wasn't testing him. I wasn't setting traps. I was observing reality without intervening. There's a kind of dignity in that. I began to understand that power doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like refusing to perform your role long enough to see how others respond. And what I saw was this. The dynamic functioned perfectly well without my emotional presence. What it required from me was compliance, not connection. That realization didn't hurt the way earlier ones had. It steadied me. Because once you know what's actually being asked of you, you can decide whether you're willing to give it. Silence had stopped being a shield. It had become a lens. And through it, everything came into focus. What they never noticed wasn't that I had gone quiet. It was that I had become attentive in a different direction. While the external rhythm of my life remained unchanged, something internal had shifted into motion. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Not for revenge, not for escape, but for alignment. I needed to understand exactly where I stood before deciding where I would go. I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, but accurately. I paid attention to patterns in communication, especially the gaps between promises and follow-through. I noticed how decisions were framed, who benefited from them, and who absorbed their consequences. I stopped assuming benign intent and started recording observable behavior. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about grounding myself in reality. I also began learning, quietly, in moments that looked unremarkable from the outside. I read about emotional labor, not to diagnose my marriage, but to give language to experiences I had normalized. I revisited financial documents I had once skimmed. I reacquainted myself with accounts, timelines, and contingencies I had trusted without question. Knowledge has a way of restoring agency. I updated my skills at work, not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted options. I expanded my professional network without announcing it. I took on projects that increased my independence, even if they didn't immediately change my income. Each small step was a reminder that my life extended beyond the role I had been performing. At home, I didn't announce any of this. There was no reason to. My preparation wasn't a performance. It was private, deliberate, and rooted in self-respect. What struck me most was how unnoticed all of this went. He didn't ask why I was spending more time reading. He didn't question why I was less available for spontaneous adjustments. He didn't notice that I no longer filled silence with reassurance. The surface of our life was smooth enough that bigger changes didn't register. That told me something important. The system relied on my output, not my awareness. I also paid attention to myself, to see how my body responded when I stopped anticipating needs, to how my mind felt when I wasn't rehearsing explanations. There was relief, not joy exactly, but spaciousness, the kind that allows you to breathe more fully. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like choosing not to reveal your clarity before it's complete. I resisted the urge to explain myself, to seek validation, to ask for understanding. Those impulses were familiar, but I recognized them now as remnants of an old pattern, the belief that being seen required translation. I no longer needed to be interpreted correctly. I needed to be positioned correctly. What they never noticed was how much energy I had been spending to maintain equilibrium, and how much became available once I stopped. I wasn't becoming colder, I was becoming precise. I began to imagine futures, not fantasies, but realistic trajectories. What would staying mean if nothing changed? What would be required if something did? I evaluated risk, timing, and consequence with the same calm I brought to everything else. There was no countdown, no secret thrill, just clarity accumulating day by day. People often think preparation is fueled by anger. Mine wasn't. It was fueled by acceptance. Acceptance of what was, not what I hoped might be. And acceptance, when honest, can be profoundly stabilizing. I noticed how others continued to interact with me as if nothing had shifted. They relied on my calm. They assumed my flexibility. They moved forward confidently, unaware that the ground beneath the dynamic was no longer reinforced by my unconscious consent. What they never noticed was that I had stopped negotiating with myself. I no longer asked whether I was asking too much. I no longer wondered if I was being fair. I focused on what was true, and truth, once fully seen, has momentum of its own. By the time anything external began to change, the internal work was already done. The position was already set. They never saw it coming because they were still interacting with the version of me that had quietly retired, and I let them. The private reveal didn't arrive like a revelation in a movie. There was no single document that changed everything, no shocking discovery that flipped a switch. It was quieter than that, more unsettling. It came from connecting details that had always been available, but never examined together. I was sitting alone when it happened. No urgency, no emotional charge, just me, a folder of information I had finally decided to read slowly instead of skimming. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't searching for proof. I was simply making sure I understood my own life. And in that understanding clarity formed, I realized how asymmetrical our arrangement had become. Not just emotionally, but structurally. Financial responsibilities that were shared in name, but not in control. Decisions framed as mutual that had been effectively unilateral. Safeguards I had assumed existed because trust made them feel unnecessary. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just an imbalance. What struck me most was not the content of what I found, but how long it had gone unquestioned. I had trusted the narrative of partnership so completely that I hadn't noticed how much of it depended on my passivity. My agreement had been assumed, my consent implied, my interests bundled into someone else's priorities. The reveal wasn't that I had been deceived. It was what I had deferred, and once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. There was no rush of anger, no sense of betrayal. Instead, there was a stillness that felt almost clinical. This is where I am. This is how things are structured. This is what would happen if nothing changed. That kind of clarity doesn't invite panic. It invites choice. I spent days with that information, letting it settle. I didn't confront him. I didn't hint. I didn't ask questions designed to confirm what I already knew. I simply integrated the knowledge into my understanding of the dynamic. The leverage wasn't power over him. It was power over myself. I understood what I could do independently, what timelines were realistic, what boundaries were possible without negotiation. I saw where my vulnerabilities actually were, and where they weren't. For the first time in a long while, I felt oriented. The strange thing about private clarity is that it often makes you more patient, not less. I wasn't in a hurry to act because I no longer felt trapped. When urgency disappears, precision takes its place. I began adjusting internally, aligning my actions with what I now knew to be true. I made small changes that didn't register as changes at all. I gathered documents, I organized information, I updated the records. No secrecy, just privacy. At home, nothing appeared different. We still slept in separate rooms. We still exchanged updates. The captions online still reflected a curated calm. But now I knew exactly what they were. Artifacts of a story that had already reached its conclusion internally. The captions were lies, but they were no longer lies I told myself. I understood then why quiet dominance is often mistaken for passivity. Because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply operates from a position of clarity that others haven't reached yet. The reveal wasn't about discovering his flaws. It was about recognizing my own leverage, not as a threat, but as a fact. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. There's a moment when you stop hoping someone will become who you need them to be and start becoming who you need yourself to be. That was the moment. From then on, every choice was filtered through a different lens. Not, how will this affect us, but how does this align with what I know? And alignment changes everything. I didn't need to expose anything. I didn't need to explain. The most powerful shifts rarely require witnesses. I had seen the structure clearly. I had located myself within it, and I knew, without drama or doubt, that I would not remain there indefinitely. The reveal was private. The consequences would be quiet. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes a different kind of choice. I reached a point where there were only a few viable paths forward, each with consequences I could now name without flinching. Staying exactly as things were, attempting to renegotiate the dynamic, or leaving the structure entirely. None of these options was abstract anymore. They were tangible, mapped, and real. For a while I sat with each one. Staying would mean accepting the role permanently, not hoping it might change, not resenting it quietly, but consenting fully to a life where my presence was functional rather than engaged. There was a strange comfort in that option. Familiar routines, predictable days, a stable image. It would require very little effort, only continued silence. Renegotiation seemed, on the surface, like the most reasonable path. Conversations, counseling, reframing expectations. I imagined what that would look like. I imagined explaining how I felt, outlining what I needed, and asking for acknowledgement. And I realized something important. Renegotiation requires mutual curiosity. I had no evidence of that. Every prior attempt to name a need had been met with reassurance rather than inquiry, solutions rather than listening. I wasn't afraid of difficult conversations. I was uninterested in conversations that existed solely to preserve the status quo. Then there was the third option, the irreversible one. Leaving wouldn't be dramatic. It wouldn't be sudden. It would simply be a reallocation of my life towards something more honest. It would involve loss, complexity, and discomfort. But it would also involve integrity. What made the decision difficult wasn't fear. It was grief. Grief for the version of the marriage I had believed in. Grief for the time I had invested. Grief for the woman I had been, while hoping things would shift on their own. I didn't rush myself. Decisions made in panic tend to replicate the very dynamics you're trying to escape. I waited until the choice felt quiet. The moment of decision didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived with alignment. I noticed that when I imagined staying, my body felt heavy. Not anxious, resigned. When I imagined renegotiating, my body felt tight, alert, braced. But when I imagined leaving, not immediately, not explosively, but deliberately, my body felt steady. That told me everything. The irreversible choice wasn't about him. It was about me. About whether I was willing to continue participating in a life that required me to be smaller than I was. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't test it in conversation. I didn't seek permission to make it. I simply chose. Choosing didn't mean acting immediately. It meant that every step from that point forward would be oriented toward that outcome. No more ambivalence, no more internal debate, just coherence. There's a particular calm that comes when you stop asking, what if? And start asking, what now? I knew there would be consequences, confusion, questions, maybe even regret from others. But I also knew that staying would have consequences too, ones that accumulated quietly and asked me to disappear slowly. The decision point wasn't dramatic, it was final. I accepted that some things would never be explained in a way that satisfied everyone. I accepted that being misunderstood was a price I was willing to pay for being aligned. From that moment on, I stopped behaving like someone who was waiting to be chosen. I began behaving like someone who had already chosen herself. And once that choice is made internally, the external world eventually catches up, whether it's ready or not. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not because I hesitated, but because haste was no longer necessary. Urgency belongs to people who are still negotiating with themselves. I wasn't. I was moving forward, quietly, with intention. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. The same routines, the same calm, the same absence of conflict. That was intentional. I didn't want a disruption to announce what I was doing. I wanted stability to protect it. Moving in silence doesn't mean secrecy born of fear. It means privacy born of clarity. I began taking care of practical things methodically. I reviewed timelines, I organized documents, I clarified what belonged to me legally, financially, and emotionally. I didn't rush through any of it. I wanted every step to feel grounded, not reactive. At work, I positioned myself carefully. I accepted projects that increased my independence and visibility without signaling departure. I strengthened professional relationships that had always existed on the periphery. Nothing opportunistic, just intentional. At home, I didn't withdraw affection dramatically or create distance to provoke a response. I remained polite, consistent, neutral. I wasn't trying to punish him. I wasn't trying to send a message. I was simply no longer overextending. That distinction mattered. People often imagine preparation as something tense and exhausting. For me, it was the opposite. Because once the internal conflict was resolved, my energy returned. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I felt less compelled to manage emotions that weren't mine. He didn't notice. Not because he was careless, but because the system still worked. Meals still happened. Schedules are still aligned. I still handled my share without complaint. There was no visible breakdown to investigate. That's the paradox of moving in silence. The more calmly you act, the less others suspect change. I did notice moments of subtle confusion, questions that lingered a little longer, glances that suggested something was missing but couldn't quite be named. He didn't ask directly. He didn't check in emotionally. He adjusted by filling the space with more of himself. That too was information. I was careful not to over-prepare. There's a temptation once you regain agency to overcorrect, to control every outcome. I resisted that. My goal wasn't dominance over him. It was sovereignty over myself. So I moved steadily, one step at a time. No dramatic exits, no ultimatums, just alignment in motion. Online, the image remained intact. Not because I wanted to deceive, but because I no longer needed the image to reflect my truth. It had become irrelevant. The caption stayed neutral. The photos are infrequent. I was no longer invested in narrating a story that was already ending internally. The captions were lies, but now they felt like artifacts, not commitments. What surprised me most during this phase was how little resistance there was. No confrontation, no questions, no attempt to re-engage me emotionally. The absence of friction confirmed what clarity had already shown me. The dynamic wasn't maintained by mutual effort. It was maintained by my accommodation, and now that accommodation had limits. Moving in silence allowed me to see who noticed, who adapted, and who continued as if nothing had changed. That information mattered. It told me what kind of aftermath to expect. By the time any external consequence would appear, the internal work was complete. I wasn't preparing to leave a relationship. I was already gone from it in the ways that mattered. Silence protected that transition, because when you announce a change too early, people respond to preserve comfort, not to understand the truth. I didn't need comfort, I needed completion, and I was moving toward it, one quiet step at a time. The consequences didn't arrive with an argument. They arrived with an absence, not the obvious kind, the kind that leaves an empty chair or an untouched room, but the subtler kind, the kind that changes how things feel without changing how they look. It started with small disruptions. Things that used to resolve themselves no longer did. Schedules overlapped awkwardly. Decisions stalled. Minor inconveniences lingered longer than they should have. Nothing catastrophic, just friction where there used to be flow. At first, he didn't connect it to me. He assumed it was stress, timing, bad luck. He adjusted by pushing forward harder, filling gaps with more momentum. But momentum can't replace coordination, and it certainly can't replace attentiveness. I noticed the shift in his tone before I noticed it in his behavior. A faint impatience, a subtle edge, not directed at me, at least not consciously, but present nonetheless. When systems stop working the way they used to, frustration looks for a source. He asked more questions, but they weren't curious ones. They were logistical. Did you already handle this? What's the plan here? Have you seen this? Questions that assumed I was still managing the background. I answered calmly, briefly, accurately. I didn't rush to fill the space between the question and the solution. I didn't take ownership of problems that weren't mine to carry. That's when the loss began to register, not as betrayal, but as inconvenience. He didn't say, "I miss how close we were." He said things like, "We seem a little off lately," as if the issue were atmospheric, not relational. As if alignment were something that drifted, not something that was maintained. Friends noticed too, though they couldn't name what had changed. Comments shifted from admiration to mild concern. "You seem quieter than usual." "Everything okay?" I answered honestly without detail. "Yes, I'm fine." And I was. What others were feeling wasn't my distress. It was the absence of my buffering, the removal of a stabilizing force they had never acknowledged as an effort. At home, the emotional distance became more visible, not because I created it, but because I stopped disguising it. I no longer bridged gaps with reassurance. I no longer softened edges preemptively. I allowed silence to be what it was. He noticed that. Not enough to ask what I needed, but enough to feel unsettled. There's a moment when people realize something essential has shifted, but they don't yet understand what. That's where we were. He sensed loss without knowing what had been lost. And because he couldn't name it, he couldn't address it. I watched this unfold with a strange combination of empathy and detachment. I wasn't pleased. I wasn't vindicated. I was simply aware that cause and effect were beginning to surface. This wasn't punishment, it was exposure. When someone has grown accustomed to your emotional labor, its absence feels like neglect, even if nothing new is being withheld. That's the quiet irony. I didn't correct his interpretation. I didn't explain that nothing had been taken away, only returned to its rightful owner. Explanations at this stage would have centered on his discomfort rather than honored my clarity. So I stayed steady. The consequences continued, not dramatically, but persistently. Miscommunications increased. Decisions required more effort. He grew more restless, more distracted. He filled the space with activity, not reflection. Still, there was no confrontation. That, too, was telling. Loss doesn't always prompt accountability. Sometimes it just reveals dependence. By the time he began to sense that something fundamental was no longer available to him, it was already too late to restore it casually. The dynamic had shifted beyond repair, not because I had done anything harsh, but because I had stopped doing what kept it afloat. And once the consequences begin, they don't need to be announced. They simply continue. By the time he realized something was wrong, he was already looking in the wrong place. He started suggesting surface-level fixes, a weekend away, a new routine, a casual, we should talk sometime. The tone was light, almost hopeful, as if what we were experiencing was a temporary dip rather than the natural conclusion of a long pattern. I listened without interrupting. I nodded when it made sense to. I didn't dismiss his efforts, but I didn't lean into them either. There's a difference between rejecting someone and no longer being available for a version of the relationship that's already expired. What he was offering now was attention, not curiosity, solutions, not accountability. He wanted to return to how things felt when they worked effortlessly for him. He didn't ask when they stopped working for me. That gap mattered. I could see the confusion forming. He wasn't angry yet. He wasn't defensive. He was unsettled. The system he relied on was no longer predictable, and he didn't know how to restore it. So he tried to re-engage me emotionally, but without slowing down enough to listen. Compliments appeared where there had been assumptions. Small gestures where there had been indifference. They weren't insincere. They were just late. Timing is everything. When care arrives only after consequence, it feels less like connection and more like damage control. I didn't respond with bitterness. I didn't punish him with coldness. I simply didn't re-enter the dynamic he was trying to revive. That's what made it impossible to fix. You can repair something only if both people still believe in the structure they're repairing. I didn't. The clarity I had reached wasn't fragile. It didn't need reassurance to hold. It had been built slowly, deliberately, and without theatrics. No amount of last-minute effort could undo the understanding that had settled in me. He began to ask more direct questions. Are you happy? Did I do something wrong? These questions weren't manipulative. They were genuine attempts to locate the problem, but they were framed around his uncertainty, not my experience. I answered honestly, but minimally. I've been thinking a lot. I'm clear about what I need. I'm not confused. Those answers didn't give him something to fix. They gave him something to face. And facing something requires humility. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked lost, as if he had missed a critical update and didn't know when it had been released. That's the danger of assuming silence means satisfaction. By the time dissatisfaction becomes visible, it's often already resolved internally. Too late doesn't mean cruel. It means misaligned. I could feel the moment when he understood, not fully, but enough. When he realized that this wasn't a phase, that I wasn't waiting for him to say the right thing, that I wasn't asking to be convinced. There was a heaviness in that realization, not panic, regret. Regret has a different texture than remorse. It looks backward instead of inward. I didn't take pleasure in that. I felt compassion for it. But compassion doesn't require reversal. I had already grieved the relationship in private. I had already accepted the loss. I wasn't standing at the beginning of an ending. I was standing at the end of a process. What made it too late wasn't stubbornness. It was completion. There are moments when a door doesn't slam. It simply closes quietly because it has served its purpose. This was one of those moments. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no list of grievances was delivered with trembling hands. Just two people sitting across from each other, aware that something irreversible had already taken place. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. That alone marked how different I felt. In the past, a request like that would have tightened something in my chest. I would have rehearsed explanations, softened language, and prepared to manage the emotional temperature of the room. This time, I didn't prepare at all. I didn't need to. He spoke first. He said he felt distance. Those things felt off. He wasn't sure when it started, but he wanted to fix it. I listened. Not defensively, not eagerly, just attentively. When he finished, there was a pause. He looked at me, waiting for reassurance, for reaction, for something familiar. I told him the truth calmly. I said that I had been clear for a long time. I had noticed how often my presence was assumed rather than engaged, that I had adjusted myself to fit a dynamic that no longer felt mutual. I didn't catalog every slight. I didn't argue timelines. I didn't try to make him feel guilty. I spoke in complete sentences without emotional charge. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I answered honestly. I had. Just not loudly. And when it became clear that my quiet signals weren't being received, I stopped sending them. That landed. There was a moment of silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that follows recognition. He nodded slowly, as if replaying things with new context. He apologized. Not defensively, not dramatically, just simply. I accepted it. Acceptance doesn't always mean continuation. He asked if we could work on it. Counseling might help. If we could try again, more intentionally this time. I didn't rush my response. I didn't soften it either. I told him that I believed him. I believed his regret was real, and that I also believed something had shifted in me that couldn't be shifted back. I explained that the clarity I had reached wasn't anger-driven. It wasn't reactive. It was the result of seeing our dynamics without illusions. I said that I no longer wanted to renegotiate a role I had outgrown. There was no argument after that, no attempt to persuade me otherwise, just a quiet understanding settling into the room. Confrontation without heat has a particular power. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't invite defense. It leaves very little room for denial. He didn't become a villain in that moment. He became human, flawed, limited, caught up in a system he had benefited from without questioning. And I didn't become cruel. I became firm. We talked about logistics next. Practicalities. Timelines. The conversation stayed grounded, respectful. When it ended, there was no dramatic exit. No slamming doors. Just a shared recognition that something significant had concluded. I felt steady. That surprised me. I had expected sadness, maybe fear. What I felt instead was coherence. The internal and external had finally aligned. Confrontation, I learned, doesn't need intensity to be effective. It needs clarity. And clarity, once spoken, doesn't need repetition. After everything settled, there was a quiet period that didn't feel empty at all. My life didn't transform overnight. There were no dramatic reinventions, no declarations about starting over. Instead, there was a steady unfolding, a return to myself that felt both unfamiliar and deeply natural. I noticed how much space I had inside my own thoughts, how little energy I spent anticipating reactions or smoothing emotional terrain. Decisions became simpler, not because they were easy, but because they were mine. I wasn't hardened by what happened. I was clarified. I began to recognize myself as someone who values presence over performance, someone who doesn't confuse peace with silence or stability with stagnation. I learned that calm can coexist with boundaries, and that kindness doesn't require self-erasure. I also noticed how differently people responded to me, not immediately, and not always consciously, but there was a shift. When I spoke, I didn't over-explain. When I disagreed, I didn't cushion it excessively. I wasn't abrupt. I was exact. Some people adjusted, some didn't. That no longer felt like a problem to solve. At work, my confidence wasn't louder. It was cleaner. I trusted my assessments. I didn't rush to a consensus. I noticed how often I had previously made things easier for others at the expense of my own clarity. Now, I let my standards be visible. In relationships, I paid attention to reciprocity. Not in a transactional way, but in a grounded one. I noticed who asked questions, who followed up, and who was curious beyond surface interaction. I no longer mistook consistency for care. The most important shift, though, was internal. I stopped seeking validation for being understanding. I stopped taking pride in how much I could endure quietly. That kind of pride, I learned, is a liability. I didn't carry bitterness toward my past self. She did the best she could with the information she had. She believed in patience. She believed in commitment. Those weren't flaws. They just needed boundaries. I also didn't carry resentment toward him. We had participated in a dynamic that made sense until it didn't. Responsibility existed on both sides, but so did growth. Who I am now is someone who listens, especially to the subtle signals. Someone who notices when she begins to disappear and pauses before that becomes a habit. Someone who understands that self-respect isn't loud, but it is non-negotiable. I still value calm. I still value thoughtfulness. I still value stability. But I no longer trade those things for invisibility. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply refuses to abandon itself for comfort. That's the strength I live from now. And it shows up not in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones, in how I speak, in how I choose, in what I no longer accept as just how things are. I didn't become someone else. I became more precise about being myself. When I look back on that chapter of my life, I don't see a story about loss. I see a story about recognition. For a long time, I believed that love was proven through endurance, that being chosen meant being adaptable, that if I stayed calm enough, patient enough, undemanding enough, I would eventually be met with the same care I was offering. What I learned instead is quieter and more difficult to accept. Some dynamics don't break because people are cruel. They break because one person is carrying the weight of the connection alone. And as long as that weight is carried silently, there is no urgency for change. The most important lesson wasn't about marriage. It was about visibility. Not the kind that comes from being seen online or admired or praised, but the kind that comes from being internally aligned, from knowing when your silence is a gift and when it has become a cost. For a long time, my silence protected others from discomfort. What it did not protect was my sense of self. And once I understood that, the choice became inevitable. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about refusing to abandon yourself in order to be palatable. It's about letting clarity guide your actions instead of fear, guilt, or hope that someone else will eventually notice. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I was clear. I didn't need to be right. I needed to be whole. And that distinction matters. There are relationships that can be repaired through conversation and effort. And there are relationships that end not because no one tried, but because one person tried long enough alone. Knowing the difference requires honesty, not the performative kind, but the private kind, the kind you practice when no one is watching and no one is applauding. If there's a moral here, it's this. Silence is powerful, but only when it is chosen. When silence becomes a survival strategy, it quietly teaches others how little they need to offer. You don't need to shout to reclaim yourself. You don't need to expose anyone to justify your departure. You don't need a dramatic ending to honor a quiet truth. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do, for yourself and for another person, is to stop participating in a dynamic that requires your disappearance. And when you do, the world doesn't always react loudly, but it does change. If this story resonated with you, maybe it's because you felt something similar, something subtle, unnamed, but persistent. Maybe you've been praised for being easy, understanding, or strong, while quietly feeling less and less present in your own life. So I'll leave you with this question, and I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments if you feel ready. Have you ever mistaken silence for peace? And if so, what did it cost you?